good! The last episode of my Fiero series was all about my mishaps and misadventures in painting, where I fully embodied the phrase, everyone starts somewhere. After dealing with so many setbacks, I fully understand why quality paint jobs cost so much money. I thought it was mostly due to all the labor that goes into the bodywork, which I'm positive is still a large percentage, but the biggest reason is probably that painting is an art. There's a steep learning curve, one that I'm still climbing. The people that do it professionally have my utmost respect because painting has stressed me out a whole lot. But that's not gonna stop me from finishing, for me, this mammoth task. We left off with every panel that needed to be red, painted red. The majority of the parts looked great in the end, but there were still 2 sets of panels that were a little rougher than the rest. For a number of reasons I went over in the last video, there were bubbles over a large portion of each of these parts. I have since learned that the technical name for this is solvent pop. In my case, I'm going to need to repaint these parts in their entirety. In my eagerness to correct these, I actually already repainted the fenders before I even finished editing the last video. Using the correct urethane activator, speeding up my paint strokes, and making sure that water was actually drained from the compressor tank really does make a difference. These look a hell of a lot better than before. So with these done, the last parts to repaint are the doors. The first step to repainting anything is sanding. But it's not too exciting of a process.
It's taking a really long time. I'm probably just gonna cut to when it's done.
So, with everything now fully sanded, scuffed, and cleaned, we're ready to paint. I'm sure that just sanding back the clear coat and applying a couple new layers of clear could do the trick, but because I've sanded it back to the raw material of the doors, the cast urethane, I need to lay on primer and more color coat before more clear. And because I still have a lot of that left over, that's not going to be a problem at all. What is going to be a problem at all is the fact that I apparently didn't do a good enough job sanding the clear coat because there were still a lot of cavities left over from the solvent pop. I should have gone a lot further in order to fully get this surface free of them. That's okay. It just means another few days of waiting before I can sand that smooth and start again. Okay, now all cavities are completely sanded away. Round 2. Or 3, actually. Another layer of epoxy primer acting as sealer, 2 medium coats of color, and 2 medium coats of clear. It wouldn't be a true Ronald Fiero episode without more problems, right? Everything laid down very well, but a mosquito thought that the passenger side would be a lovely place to die. Luckily, after some time curing, sanding, and polishing, his new grave is now only a memory. So, with these taken care of, I am now at the point where I should have been at the end of last episode if I hadn't made any mistakes. Now, all that's left regarding paintwork are the black accent pieces. So I'm gonna get to work on those. For no particular reason, I started with the underside of the deck lid. It's a mishmash of overspray and the old original paint. Starting off with dish soap, water, and maroon scuff pads, the surface was both degreased and prepped at the same time. Wanting to speed things up a tiny bit, I pulled out the pneumatic sander and gave a quick buzz over the large flat surfaces. The smaller nooks and crannies still had to be hit, so more sanding and scuffing happened there. With the panel rinsed off and fully dried, it was flipped over again to be masked off to protect that glossy red. We started with a perimeter of tape and then another perimeter on top of that holding down this masking sheet. Then, the whole thing was flipped over for a final time and one last line of tape was laid down on the edge. The last thing to do was remove the old flaking, peeling stickers. I should have done this first honestly, but I actually forgot about them. A razor did the bulk of the work, but there was a lot of residue left over. Goo Gone took care of that. After a little scuffy scuff and a wipe down with wax and grease remover to get rid of any remaining residue, the whole panel was then degreased a final time, and the fresh paint is now ready to be laid on. This was my first time doing a panel where I couldn't just sweep all the way across in one smooth motion. I had to tackle it in chunks because of the skeletal shape of the inner structure. Luckily, both the epoxy primer and the single stage satin black paint went on and flowed into itself very nicely. So we went from this to this. It's subtle, but at the same time a big difference. All that's left now is... wow. It finally looks like a finished piece and not something that's part of a project. Is it perfect? Of course not. Don't be ridiculous, Caleb. Is it great though? I sure think so.
Do you guys remember how I tore the fiberglass around the lock cylinder hole, but I fixed that? Do you remember when I dropped the deck lid in the last video and shattered the corner, but I fixed that? Wouldn't it be absolutely hilarious if there was a trifecta of things to fix? Yeah, that's a big fucking yikes from me, dog.
Something happened. I'm not sure what. Well, no, that's not true. I know what. I'm not exactly sure why. Clearly, the paint is missing here and it looks like complete garbage, but it wasn't the paint on the panel that came off, but the body filler that came off. See, the panel had been looking absolutely perfect on the outside until we washed the underside. Now, the washing didn't cause this. I caused this with a razor blade picking at the paint. But what the washing caused was this bubbling. Maybe hard to see, but there's 3 bubbles around here. I think that rinsing the hell out of it and also tipping the panel back and trying to drain the water actually made a lot of it go directly into this cavity here. The cavity that happens to be right where the issues are. And because it's a cavity hidden from the world, that means that there was never any primer or paint sprayed on it from the factory. It's just the raw sheet molding compound, a relatively porous material. With no primer or paint acting as a barrier, I'm guessing that it soaked up some, if not a lot, of the huge pool of water that was down there and caused the separation to happen between the body and the body filler. Is that what happened for sure? I don't know. I do know that there was only an issue after the introduction of the large amount of water, but it also could just be part of the problem. It's possible that I hadn't done the best surface prep for the body filler when originally applying it. The filler is from the repair I did back in part 8 when fixing the lock cylinder hole that I ripped apart back in part 2. This actually feels really smooth. I think I used 320 when smoothing everything out, when I probably should have used something like 80 or 120 to roughen up the surface for better adhesion. But whatever the reason is for this, or reasons, this fucking sucks. But more content for you guys, right? It's gonna be an easy fix, just time consuming. Because the issue seemed to be only the adhesion of the Rust-Oleum primer and body filler onto the raw SMC, the raw sheet molding compound, I'm going to sand this back until both of those things are completely gone. And this dark edge around the perimeter is the factory primer, so seeing that means I'm good to go for the next step. The epoxy primer that I've been using on everything else bonds really well to the SMC. To give it even more of a fighting chance, I'm gonna give the panel a few scrapey scrapes with 80 grit sandpaper, just to make sure there'll be a solid bond, good mechanical adhesion. A few coats of the epoxy primer later, there's now finally a good foundation for this repair. Both the fixing and the painting will be exactly the same as before from here on out. This looks damn good. On both sides, finally. Okay, let's move on. Of the parts that need to be black, there's still the underside of the hood and headlight doors, pads and molding of the bumpers, as well as all of the side trim. Alright, so now everything that needed to be painted is fully painted. Paint booth, I relinquish thee.
You got it, Pontiac.
So much more space.
So much space.
But can we just take a second to appreciate how well these bumpers came out again? And yeah, the hood and trim pieces are great, sure, but these are the bee's knees. And you gotta respect the bee's knees. And all knees. Okay, back to the barn. Wow, this floor is a mess. Nice. It should still probably be power washed to fully clean it, but that'll come later. With this now clear, it's time to start piecing this car back together. Except guess what? I already started doing that a while ago. Let's travel back in time to when I was still filming part 11. Hello again, paint booth. The first panel that has to go on is the rear clip. It absolutely has to be the first since it goes underneath the roof panel, for one, and two, it determines the panel gap for important parts like the deck lid and doors, which in turn determines the panel gap for the parts next to those. The rear clip is a baseline for everything. And also, I had to make room in the barn for more painting since this thing is just so honking huge. But, another but. Before the rear clip can go on, there were some things in this section that needed to be addressed first. Because it'll be sandwiched, the fuel filler inlet flange connector thing had to be refurbished and installed prior to the rear clip. Next to that is the airbox, which didn't have to be touched at this point, but it does get partially obstructed when the clip is on, so I thought I would go ahead and take care of that too. To see how we got here, with them all nice and clean already, let's go back in time once more. The fuel filler flange actually came off the car when I originally pulled the rear clip, but the airbox was still in its place on the chassis. Luckily, just undoing a few bolts here and there takes the whole thing off. The plastic baffle and rubber connector were looking pretty filthy. but a quick scrub down with detergent and a stiff plastic bristle brush really got them clean. The brackets looked pretty gnarly at first, but washing them showed that the majority of the grossness was just grime. There's still some rust happening, so they were blasted clean, wiped down, and then given a good coat of automotive enamel paint. The bolts were also pretty gross. The wire wheel on my bench grinder took care of that though. And I really can't be bothered to fully restore this hardware, so a lick of black paint is good enough for me. And hey, it's all looking really spiffy. Before I put it back on the car, I want to clean up this little corner of the chassis. Both the pocket that the airbox obstructs, as well as the little bit of surface rust on the fuel filler hardline. Nice! Sticking with the theme of the project, not perfect, but better for sure. So now it's the part that actually has to be taken care of for the clip to go on.
So there's one final piece to go on, and that is an intermediate bracket between the filler neck and the body panel. And it goes on something like this, and the final spot will be about right here, where it wants to sit with the panel attached. But this is looking pretty gross.
Yeah, it is. So let's do something about that. The worst part is probably just the EVA foam cushion that goes in between the body and the flange. So that's the first to go. Now from the factory this is plated steel, but because I blasted it clean, it has to be painted to protect it from future rusting. With that set to dry, let's turn our attention to the cushion. I want to make a new one, but I wanted to start off with a better template to trace than this. So after heading inside and scanning this into the computer, the image can be brought into Photoshop. And here we can do a little bit of straightening out to get it looking a little less distorted.
After that, we can go to Adobe Illustrator to trace it in order to have an exact copy of it, as well as have a digital vector file so we can recreate it in the future if need be.
For here, all I'm really doing is just tracing the image out as best as I can. The whole point of this is just to get me a really clean template that's perfectly precise. This may seem a bit familiar to a few people because this is actually what I already covered in the video I made a while back on making vector graphics for CNC manufacturing. In case you didn't catch that video, I'll link it in the description. It covers a bit more in depth about what I just showed, as well as 2 other methods to end up with a vector file for manufacturing gaskets. Clearly, I'm not going to be sending this out to be manufactured, I'll just be tracing it and cutting by hand. So, making a digital image to trace out when I already have the original is a bit overkill, but the computer is a bit more forgiving than trying to physically trace a floppy crumbling gasket. To replace the old sheet of adhesive-backed EVA foam, I bought a new sheet of adhesive-backed EVA foam. And seriously, this 99-cent sheet from the craft store is the exact same material that was used from the factory. And I don't know about you guys, but I'd say that this is an improvement. With it cut out and the bracket thing now dry, it's just a matter of sticking it on there. Now to slap this shiny piece back onto the car. The holes for it are actually slotted for adjustment, so this is just going to be temporarily tightened down until the rear clip is set in place. So now with both the airbox and the flange thing taken care of, let's go back to the future where the rear clip is done being painted, which is actually also the past because I've yet to paint the rest of the parts. Time is weird. The roof needs to come off first because, like I said, the rear clip sits below it. From the factory, there was a strip of foam running along the perimeter on top of the chassis in order to keep noise from vibrations of the panels down. And if you recall back in part 9, I wire wheeled all of that off so I could paint the roof. So, I need to stick on this new one. Okay, now with this on, it's time to awkwardly waddle this thing out of the barn and onto the car. After pulling away the trunk weather stripping, which was interfering with the rear clip, temporarily placing the roof back to safety on top of the car, and taking some ugly fasteners and making them look pretty, as well as installing them. Holy crap, this thing is actually starting to look like a car again. Wow. Okay, but let's not stop here. One final time jump forward takes us back to present day, where now all of the panels are done. Before I start slapping on every single panel right now, I want to go ahead and wrap up the middle section of the car. That means the roof is being installed next. For good this time. If you recall back to part 8, I had to remove these rusty sunroof tracks. These guys caused a lot of headache when trying to remove the roof, because not only do these guys hold the weather stripping for the sunroof, but they also hold the roof down to the chassis. They are going to be replaced with these brand new ones. And to prevent these from being a rusty mess too, there's actually some holes that have to be drilled into the roof panel. I mentioned previously how GM designed the chassis to allow excess water to flow out and down from the inside, and that's great and all, but it kinda doesn't matter if you don't let the water get down there in the first place, so it can do that. GM realized their mistake after production started and issued a service bulletin saying to drill a hole in each corner of the sunroof seal section of the roof panel. That way, instead of the water pooling up in here and expediting the rusting process like it did, it'll just drain down and out like they originally wanted it to. These new tracks sandwich the roof down to the chassis by threading in some bolts from the inside through to here. Besides being attached to the chassis with the bolts alone, they're also attached to the roof panel directly with the rivets. And here is where I promptly decided to not read the installation instructions for the sunroof tracks. The new tracks don't come with any holes for rivets though, so what I did was place the tracks where they're supposed to be and run a drill through the hole and into the track. And what we're left with is a center point. I didn't want to drill all the way through here upside down because it's so awkward doing that, so the center points allow me to bring these over to the drill press and go to town. With the roof mocked up on the car, we can see that there's a slight issue with the rivets. The only rivets I could find that were the same diameter as the factory hole are just way too long. They bottom out on the chassis itself. And yes, they do shrink in height when compressed, but even that wouldn't be enough for the space between the chassis and the roof. So my plan? Use smaller and shorter rivets. Now clearly, smaller rivets alone won't work because they would just slip through the large hole, but with the use of a washer, the diameter can be reduced. See, the rivet will squeeze tight against the washer, which will squeeze tight against the roof. It's all the exact same clamping force and security as the larger rivet, it's just more parts to work with. And the super glue here is just to hold it in place until the rivet itself will be doing that. And because I don't have to rivet these down just yet and can do that on the roof, I opted to wait until then when everything is where it's supposed to be for good. The only rivets that absolutely have to be installed now were the ones for these parts, which are the sunroof bracket receptacles. They naturally want to sit a little lower than where they should be, so I had to clamp these down in order to rivet them, something I couldn't do if the panel was on the car. And with all that taken care of, it's time to actually install this thing. And this is going to be a little more permanent of an installation than any of the other panels on the car, because it's not just nuts and bolts holding it down, but also adhesive. This butyl rope is going to line the perimeter of the windshield for securing and sealing. And there's a slight issue right out the bat, and that is that the rope is too wide. At least for the A-pillars. It doesn't matter at all for the top part. I ordered a 3/4 inch round rope, but what I got was 1/2 inch by 7/8 inch rectangle, even though the box does say round. I ended up just cutting the sections that go on the A-pillars in half. And now with the help from Elise, we loaded the roof onto the car. But the roof was way too high. Very too high, actually. I panicked a little bit, like I do, because we had to pull the roof off. But it's okay, we got it there without breaking anything this time. There really isn't a lot of good information about what size butyl to get, since not a whole lot of people remove the roof when working on one of these cars. all I could really find is approximate guesses on old forum posts. That combined with me doing my best to measure the depth of the cavity between the chassis and the panel, I came up with 3/8 inch round butyl. And it was actually round this time. Only problem is that 3/8 of an inch is on the other end of the not fitting spectrum, and is a little too thin this time. It really is always something with this car. The roof was really only making contact with the butyl on the top corners. I ended up doubling up the butyl on the A-pillars and adding a thin strip of regular butyl tape that can be found at a local hardware store on the top. With that taken care of, the roof is now sitting on there fine. Truth be told, it is still a little high, this time on the A-pillars. And that shouldn't be a problem though. It's so very slight that I can't imagine it would make a difference. I mean, it's still sealed just fine, being butyl and all. Not to mention, when I swap out the windshield, we can make sure to go a little thicker with the adhesive to have the windshield sitting flush with the panel. All in all, it'll still work and it'll still look great. The last thing to do was rivet those tracks to the roof. I didn't film any of what's next because it's not exactly riveting to show more riveting, but I only got a few rivets to actually work because for most of them, the super glue didn't hold and the washers just fell off and down into the cavity. Nice, really nice. As you can see now, there's just silicone filling those holes. And that's because I finally read the instructions for installing these, and it said to fill the original holes with silicone. Granted, it shouldn't really matter since it would just be another drain hole for water buildup, but for me, it did ensure that the washers that fell down there wouldn't be rattling around as I drive. So, for actually securing it down where the rivets didn't work, I was instructed to just drill a teeny tiny hole next to the original hole and use a small button head sheet metal screw, and actually thread directly into the fiberglass. With these attached to the roof now, it's just a matter of bolting everything down from the inside. And now, a little bit of weather stripping adhesive was run along only the tracks, then the brand new seal from the Fiero store was popped in place. The only thing left to finish this roof up is the sunroof itself. Pulling it out of its storage spot, we can see that the hardware for it is a little bit rusty. Let's fix that, shall we? So, that's the top of the center of the car wrapped up. How about the sides? There's two more parts preventing the interior from finally being fully installed, since there's access needed from the inside for some nuts, and those parts are the sail panels. With the clips popped in place, new foam adhered, and the nuts threaded on, god damn, I've been waiting to see these attached. It was worth the wait. But keeping up with the task of finishing up the center section of the car, let's move to the inside. So, with the roof fully bolted in place and the sail panels installed, that's the last of the panels that had to be bolted in from the inside of the car. That means that we can finally install the rest. And I accidentally took apart the entire interior. Whoops. Don't you hate when that happens? The reason for gutting the interior again was because of insulation. Back when I restored the engine bay, I got rid of all of the factory insulation since it was just crumbling away. I replaced it, but only with thermal insulation, not acoustic, and the factory one was both. So I need to do something about that. Now, there's a bunch of different manufacturers of sound deadening material, and honestly, they're all pretty much the exact same thing. The one I got is the Killmat brand, and it happened to be pretty affordable and available on Prime with Amazon, so that's why I got it. The name of the game for installing it is making sure everything is clean, cutting the panels to fit, then sticking them on, and pressing them down with this small but hefty roller. Just repeat that again and again. It actually takes a fair bit of time. Just this one side took about 45 minutes. And with the sheer amount of rolling that has to be done, by the end of it, you'll really start to feel it in your forearm. Takes me back to middle school. But now, the interior is looking like a 70s sci-fi movie set.
So with the sound deadening now in, that's everything for the interior that I wanted to address taken care of. Well, besides the rusty shifter mechanism and center console brackets.
With the carpet back in, the interior is pretty much exactly how it was before I gutted it, only quieter now. Time to take it a step further and bring out this box that has been taking up so much space inside the house for a year and a half. I'm handing off the mic because this is the headliner. If you recall, the original headliner was a crumbling foam mess infested with mold that was no way salvageable. Lucky for me, the Fiero store offers ABS plastic replacements. You can get just the plastic headliner board, but the one I got came pre-installed with the liner. The only thing that wasn't done were the cutouts for the holes. I had to do that all myself, but it was only a few minutes. Before I go installing this all willy-nilly, I need to do something about these trim pieces. They help support the headliner, but I don't want to put them in as is because they are pretty gnarly looking. Besides the plastic welding I did for a crack here, they're mainly bad because of sun bleaching. To remedy that, I picked up some vinyl and fabric paint from the local auto parts store. Now, these panels are neither vinyl nor fabric, but I've heard good things about this product for this application. Now, it may be obvious, but this is a fair bit lighter than the factory tan. Definitely not as orangish, but that's okay. I'm more concerned about the color being consistent than I am about the color being factory. So after a bit more painting, we're left with a big old pile of parts, ready for installation. With a little bit of awkwardness, the headliner was lifted up and secured at first with the coat hanger hooks in the back, then the overhead console from the front. Next was the sunroof latch cover plate bezel thing. And to hold the edges of the headliner up, I threw on the B-pillar and A-pillar trim pieces. The last piece for around the door was the one that ran along the bottom. However, I didn't want to install it the way the factory had it with just self-tapping screws, because over half of the holes were already stripped out. The screws would just be spinning around. Because I spent so much time trying to reduce the noise in this car, I did not want these pieces rattling. So I installed some M4 riv nuts into the holes. If you're unfamiliar with these, they basically get squished into metal similar to a regular rivet, but there's a hole that's threaded for screwing things into it. It's basically a fast way around welding nuts to things. So with that now in place, let's install some sun visors. I also bought these well over a year ago, and I've been itching to install them. I do have to harvest the factory mounts off the crumbling moldy originals though. And with that done, it's just a matter of screwing them in.
God damn it! Oh!
The only silver lining is that it's covered by the visor when it's closed, which is how it'll be the majority of the time, so is it really that bad?
The next step should be trimming this up a little bit, inserting the headliner into this little groove, inserting the molding that goes all the way around and cutting off the excess. But I have absolutely no idea where the molding is for this. I bought it over 2 years ago, and I guess in that time I lost it. So for right now, I'm just gonna leave this exactly how it is and just pretend that everything's okay. See? It's perfect.
The last little parts to be bolted back up are the seat belt anchors. One bolt on the bottom, one on the top, and then a little cover plate. Taking a sidestep from simply bolting things up, I wanted to do a bit more cleaning up. Kind of. The speaker grills are super faded. Aside from looking bad, having something that light in color on your dash is not great for windshield reflections. So, I got more of that vinyl and fabric spray and coated these to be black. I think from the factory they were the same brown as the dash, but black works for me. One last thing on the dash I want to take care of is this little vinyl rectangle. It was originally just a trim piece that had an elastic band for holding maps and things, but that guy is no longer in service, so just the vinyl rectangle remains. And originally there were 4 plastic studs, one in each corner, that slip through the holes in the dash and get secured from the inside, but seeing as how all of those are broken off mine, I figured this was the next best option. It's more than strong enough to hold this guy up and never fall off, but not too strong to the point where it's inseparable. Maybe. But cool. Next to go in, the seats, but not quite. I got a lot of grief in the comments back in part 5 for not doing anything about these rusty seat rails being installed on the seats with their brand new upholstery, and I agree with those people. What was I thinking? To clean these up, I just popped them off and knocked back any loose rust with the wire wheel on my drill, and after giving them a thorough cleaning, they were hung up, and I masked off the little plastic knob that you grab to adjust the seats.
God damn it. God fucking damn it.
After that, they were hit with some rust-converting spray paint. Is this a perfect cleanup? No, you know it's not, but it's definitely better than what it was. The seats were then set inside, speakers plugged in, the nuts tightened down. The very last thing to do to wrap up cosmetics in here is finally putting back on that little rubber pad for the clutch pedal. I don't know why I haven't done that. But with that on now, and looking a little worn honestly, but still better than without, that's everything wrapped up for the cosmetics for the interior. On the actual chassis at least, clearly there's still the door panels to add, but that panel would cover the inner dew wipe that still needs to be attached, which blocks access to the nuts that hold on the mirror. That can't go on until the outer door skin goes on, but that can't go on until all of the inner hardware is restored and the outer trim installed, so I'm calling this good enough for now.
I am super excited, super happy that the interior is more or less back together. There's still a few things to do, obviously, but overall, it's back together. I'm excited. The biggest thing I'm happy about is actually just the roof being back on with the sunroof. Everything with the vapor barriers in the doors is now sealed up. So like, if I had to move the Fiero out of the barn for whatever reason and it happened to rain that day or night, I wouldn't have to worry about any of the interior getting ruined along with anything inside of it. Like for example, this Fingerprints Workshop Fiero t-shirt that's available for purchase, or maybe even this digital text.
The interior seriously does look great. I mean, besides that stupid hole in the headliner put in by a stupid person, it looks good. All in all, this is a really clean specimen of questionable 80s aesthetics. I am really happy. Really happy. And actually, speaking of things looking good, there is one thing for the interior that doesn't look good, and it doesn't look good because it's kind of not there at all at the moment.
There's still one very, very important thing I gotta take care of for the interior. Funnily enough, back in part 5, the first interior episode, I didn't take care of it then, and I don't think I got a single comment about it, surprisingly. Bonus points to you if you know what I'm talking about. It is extremely important that I take care of it. Looking forward to your guesses.
What I'm also looking forward to is seeing this car wrapped up. Truth be told, there's still a lot of little things to take care of. So much so that it'll be a few more videos before this is completely done. I want to take you guys along for the ride, not just show you a highlight reel of the ride that is me just putting it together in 30 seconds. Aside from all the door stuff I mentioned and the other interior components, there's still a decent amount of work to do for the back end of the car as well as the front end. So, do look forward to that. Oh, and also maybe look forward to a video next week on how the shifter mechanism got cleaned up. Oh wait, hold on. There was one more thing I wanted to show you guys now. Back when I replaced every single burnt out light bulb for the instrument cluster, I never actually showed you guys what it looks like with the lights on. I mean, it's not very exciting, but... Wait a minute, what is that? The fuel gauge? Pegged all the way to the side? Oh no, I think I'm gonna have to drop the gas tank again. But... not now. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.
Another piece of broken glass.